The black Mercedes stopped abruptly in the scorching Mojave Desert, dust swirling around its gleaming surface as Richard Montgomery stepped out, his expensive suit already darkening with sweat. Three identical blonde toddlers in pink, blue, and yellow sundresses tumbled from the back seat, their confused giggles echoing across the endless sand. "Stay here, girls. Daddy will be right back," Richard whispered, his voice cracking as he avoided their trusting blue eyes. The car door slammed. The engine roared. Within seconds, the Mercedes disappeared into a cloud of desert dust, leaving only the acrid smell of burning rubber. Sophia, Mary, and Bethany stood frozen, their small hands instinctively finding each other as the terrible silence stretched between them and the empty horizon. Then Sophia began to cry. Mary joined her. Bethany's wails pierced the desert air like a siren. From behind a cluster of sun-bleached rocks, a German shepherd emerged, scarred, limping, military dog tags glinting against his weathered fur. The children fell silent, 3 pairs of eyes locked on the mysterious stranger. Would he attack, or had fate just delivered their guardian angel? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Richard Montgomery had been Nevada's golden boy, a real estate mogul whose signature graced billion-dollar casino developments across Las Vegas. His penthouse office overlooked the Strip, where neon lights painted his success story in brilliant colors every night. But success, Richard learned too late, could crumble faster than a house of cards. The cancer took his wife Sarah first, leaving him alone with 3-year-old triplets who shared her blonde hair and infectious laugh. Sophia, the eldest by mere minutes, had inherited Sarah's protective instincts, always positioning herself between her sisters and any perceived threat. Mary possessed an unsettling ability to sense emotions, often patting Richard's cheek when he tried to hide his tears. Bethany, the baby, gravitated toward every stray animal in their gated community, much to their nanny's dismay. As medical bills mounted and grief clouded his judgment, Richard made increasingly desperate financial decisions. The casino project that was supposed to secure their future became a sinkhole of debt. Partners vanished. Investors sued. Within months, the Montgomery empire collapsed, leaving behind $50 million in obligations and some very dangerous creditors. The men who came to his office didn't wear suits or carry briefcases. They spoke in quiet voices about payment schedules and consequences for default. When Richard explained his situation, they smiled and mentioned his beautiful daughters and how accidents happen to children every day. Meanwhile, 8-year-old Rex wandered the desert outskirts, a ghost of his former self. 3 tours in Afghanistan had forged him into a legendary military working dog. 12 soldiers owed their lives to his nose and courage. But the IED explosion that killed his handler, Sergeant Maria Santos, had shattered more than Rex's left hip. The survivor's guilt that consumed him made civilian life impossible. The military retirement facility meant well, but Rex couldn't adapt to soft beds and regular mealtimes when his brothers-in-arms remained overseas. He'd escaped 6 months ago, choosing the harsh freedom of the desert over the suffocating safety of retirement. His scarred muzzle and distinctive limp made him easily recognizable, but the vast Mojave offered endless places to hide. Margaret Chen had been searching for Rex ever since. As his former trainer and the closest thing to family he'd known since Maria's death, she understood his psychological wounds better than any veterinarian. Her wildlife rescue organization provided the perfect cover for her real mission, bringing Rex home. Frank and Sarah Henderson lived in a modest ranch house where the suburbs met the desert. Married 52 years, they'd raised 4 children who now lived scattered across the country, too busy for visits. Their grandchildren were strangers, casualties of a bitter custody battle that left the elderly couple aching for young voices in their quiet home. When the loan sharks gave Richard his final ultimatum, $2 million in 48 hours or something unfortunate would happen to his girls. He faced an impossible choice. He could run, hoping to buy time and protect them from a distance, or he could stay and watch his daughters pay the price for his failures. Richard chose exile, believing temporary abandonment was better than permanent loss. The pre-dawn darkness still clung to Richard's penthouse as he moved through the empty rooms like a sleepwalker. Each step felt leaden, each breath a betrayal of the decision he'd made. The triplets slept peacefully in their matching beds, blonde curls spread across princess pillows, unaware that their world was about to shatter. Richard stood in their doorway for what he knew would be the last time, memorizing the soft rhythm of their breathing, the way Bethany clutched her stuffed elephant, how Mary had somehow migrated to Sophia's bed during the night. His hands shook as he dressed them in their favorite sundresses, pink for Sophia, blue for Mary, yellow for Bethany. Sarah had bought these outfits just weeks before the cancer diagnosis, laughing as she explained that the bright colors would help tell the girls apart in photos. Now those same colors would help searchers identify them in the desert. The irony twisted in his chest like a knife. "Where are we going, Daddy?" Sophia asked drowsily as he buckled them into their car seats. Her intuitive nature had always made her the most perceptive of the three. "On an adventure," Richard lied, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his soul. "Just for a little while." The drive to the Mojave took 90 minutes. 90 minutes of children's songs playing softly on the radio, of Mary humming along in her sweet off-key voice, of Bethany chattering about the big kitties she hoped to see in the desert. Richard's knuckles went white on the steering wheel as he fought the urge to turn around, to face whatever consequences awaited them together. The sun was just cresting the horizon when he pulled off Highway 95 onto a dirt road that led nowhere. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, red rock formations jutting from golden sand like ancient monuments to solitude. This was far enough from civilization that the girls would be found quickly once he made the anonymous call, but remote enough that his creditor's reach couldn't extend here. That was the plan, anyway. Temporary separation. A few hours of terror followed by rescue and safety while he disappeared forever. It was supposed to be merciful. Rex had been tracking the unusual scent pattern for 20 minutes. 3 small humans in a metal box that reeked of fear and desperation. His military training had taught him to recognize distress signals, and every instinct screamed that something was wrong. He positioned himself behind a cluster of red rocks, watching as the black vehicle stopped in the open desert. The man who emerged moved with the jerky urgency of someone at the breaking point. Rex's scarred ears picked up the tremor in his voice as he spoke to the children, the way his breathing came in short, panicked bursts. This wasn't a normal family outing. "Stay here, girls. Daddy will be right back." The words carried across the desert air, and Rex felt his hackles rise. In 3 tours of duty, he'd learned to recognize lies, and this one screamed danger. The children tumbled out of the car like puppies, their bright dresses a splash of color against the monotone landscape. Rex's trained eye catalogued every detail, their age, their identical features, the way they instinctively stayed close together. These were babies, barely past toddlers, and they had no understanding of what was happening. When the car disappeared in a cloud of dust, Rex watched the children's confusion transform into terror. Their cries echoed off the rock formations, a sound that triggered every protective instinct he possessed. For 6 months, he'd wandered the desert without purpose, a soldier without a mission. Now, watching 3 helpless children left to die in the wilderness, he found his calling again. 20 miles away, Margaret Chen studied the GPS coordinates on her laptop with growing unease. Rex's tracking chip had gone dark 6 months ago, but she'd been following reports of German shepherd sightings across the region. The pattern suggested he was moving in ever-widening circles, like an animal searching for something he'd lost. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from the Henderson Ranch. Frank's weathered voice crackled through the speaker. "Margaret, you need to see the news. Some bastard just abandoned 3 little girls in the desert. If Rex is out there—" Margaret's blood ran cold. She understood Rex's psychology better than anyone. His unshakable need to protect, his inability to abandon the innocent. If he encountered those children, he wouldn't hesitate to intervene, regardless of his own survival. Meanwhile, Richard's hands trembled as he dialed 911 from a payphone 50 miles away. "I want to report 3 missing children," he said, his voice disguised with a heavy accent. "Mojave Desert, off Highway 95, 3 little girls in colored dresses." He hung up before they could trace the call, his heart hammering against his ribs. The anonymous tip would bring searchers, but the desert was vast and unforgiving. In 110-degree heat, the children had hours, not days. Rex understood this with the clarity of a seasoned soldier. As the sun climbed higher, painting the rocks in shades of gold and crimson, he made his decision. The mission parameters were clear. 3 children needed protection. Everything else was secondary. Rex approached the children with the calculated caution of a soldier entering hostile territory. His scarred muzzle caught their scent, fear, confusion, and the sweet innocence that reminded him of the Afghan children he'd protected during his tours. The triplets had stopped crying, their identical blue eyes fixed on his battle-worn form with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Bethany, the youngest, extended her small hand toward him first. Her natural affinity for animals overrode her fear, and something in Rex's amber eyes told her he meant no harm. The German shepherd froze, remembering his handler Maria's gentle touch, the way she'd scratch behind his ears after a successful mission. This child's gesture carried the same fearless trust. Rex lowered himself onto his belly, making himself less threatening despite the pain that shot through his injured hip. His military training had taught him patience, and these children needed reassurance, not another frightening element in their nightmare. When Bethany's fingers finally made contact with his warm fur, she smiled for the first time since her father's abandonment. "Nice doggy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. Sophia and Mary crept closer, their survival instincts recognizing safety when they saw it. Rex remained perfectly still as 6 small hands explored his coat, finding the raised scars from shrapnel and the dog tags that bore his military identification. The desert heat was already becoming dangerous. Rex's internal clock, calibrated by years of desert warfare, told him they had perhaps 3 hours before dehydration became critical. His nose, trained to detect water sources from miles away, caught the faint mineral scent that indicated an underground spring. He'd discovered it during his wandering months, a hidden sanctuary in the rock formations to the east. Rising carefully to his feet, Rex began the delicate process of herding the children toward safety. His movements were purposeful but gentle, using his body to guide them in the right direction. When Sophia hesitated, he nudged her softly with his muzzle, his brown eyes conveying urgency without alarm. The journey to the cave system took nearly an hour. Rex set a pace the children could manage, stopping frequently to let them rest in whatever shade he could find. His limp grew more pronounced with each step, but his determination never wavered. Mary, with her intuitive nature, seemed to sense his discomfort and began patting his head whenever they paused, whispering soft words of encouragement. The cave entrance was partially hidden behind a curtain of desert brush, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Rex pushed through the vegetation first, ensuring the space was safe before allowing the children to follow. The temperature drop was immediate and blessed, at least 20 degrees cooler than the scorching desert floor. What they discovered inside took their breath away. Ancient petroglyphs covered the stone walls, painted in ochre and charcoal by Native American hands centuries ago. The images depicted a story as old as time, humans and animals working together, protecting each other against the harsh realities of desert life. In one particularly striking panel, a group of children sat beside a large dog-like figure while hunters provided food and water. Bethany pointed at the images with wonder. "Look, it's us!" Her childish interpretation wasn't far from the truth. The parallel between their situation and the ancient artwork was unmistakable, as if fate had guided them to this exact sanctuary. The underground spring bubbled up from a crack in the rocks, creating a small pool of crystal-clear water. Rex tested it first, his trained senses confirming its safety before allowing the children to drink. They cupped the cool liquid in their small hands, laughing as it dripped through their fingers. For the first time since their abandonment, they felt genuine relief. While the children explored their cave sanctuary, Margaret Chen was following Rex's trail with the methodical precision of a tracker. Her years of training military working dogs had taught her to think like them, to anticipate their decisions based on terrain and circumstances. When she found tire tracks in the sand and evidence of a hurried departure, her worst fears were confirmed. Her satellite phone crackled to life with an incoming call from the Rescue Coordination Center. "Margaret, we've got a situation. Anonymous tip about 3 abandoned children in the Mojave. Description matches the morning news report. Triplets, ages 3, wearing colored sundresses." Margaret's throat tightened. If Rex had encountered those children, he would have appointed himself their protector. His military conditioning wouldn't allow him to abandon civilians in distress, regardless of his own survival needs. She punched coordinates into her GPS and began driving toward the last known sighting location. Back at the Henderson Ranch, Frank was preparing his old Vietnam-era field gear with the muscle memory of a soldier. His wife Sarah watched with concern as he checked his compass and loaded water bottles into his backpack. "You're 74 years old, Frank Henderson," she said, her voice tight with worry. "And I'm a Vietnam veteran who knows how military dogs think," he replied firmly. "If Rex is out there with those babies, he'll need backup. That dog won't abandon his post, even if it kills him." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the desert floor, but inside the cave, the children were beginning to feel safe for the first time in hours. Rex positioned himself at the entrance, his senses on high alert for any approaching danger. His scarred ears swiveled constantly, cataloging every sound, the whisper of wind through rock, the distant cry of a hawk, the soft breathing of the children behind him. As the hours passed and the children grew drowsy from their ordeal, Rex made a decision that would define his final mission. These weren't just civilians to be protected. They were his pack now, and he would guard them with his life. Dawn of the second day brought new challenges that tested Rex's military training to its limits. The children had slept fitfully against his warm body, but their small reserves were depleting rapidly. Sophia woke first, her natural leadership asserting itself as she gently roused her sisters. Rex watched with approval as she organized their meager resources. A few berries he'd found the previous evening, careful rationing of water from the spring. The German Shepherd's tactical mind was already calculating survival probabilities. 3-year-old children in desert conditions had limited endurance. His own body was failing too. The old shrapnel wounds ached constantly, and his injured hip sent shooting pains up his spine with every movement. But abandoning his post wasn't an option. The code he'd lived by in Afghanistan applied here: leave no one behind. Rex began teaching the children basic survival skills through demonstration. He showed them how to stay in shade during the hottest parts of the day, how to conserve water by taking small sips, how to remain calm when fear threatened to overwhelm them. Mary, with her empathetic nature, seemed to understand his silent communications best, translating his actions for her sisters in her sweet, lisping voice. "Rex says we have to be brave," she explained, stroking his scarred head. "Like soldiers." The irony wasn't lost on him. These babies were showing more courage than some seasoned troops he'd served with. Bethany had appointed herself his medic, using strips torn from her yellow dress to wrap around his leg where the limp was most pronounced. Her tiny fingers worked with surprising gentleness, and Rex submitted to her ministrations with patient grace. 20 miles away, Margaret Chen was coordinating the largest search and rescue operation Nevada had seen in years. The story had gone national overnight. Billionaire abandons triplets in desert, and volunteers were pouring in from across the Southwest. But Margaret's focus remained laser-sharp on finding Rex. She knew that if he'd encountered those children, he wouldn't leave them voluntarily. Her command post, established in the Hendersons' ranch house, buzzed with activity. Sarah Henderson moved between volunteers like a mother hen, providing coffee and sandwiches while Frank studied topographical maps with the intensity of a battlefield commander. His weathered finger traced possible routes, his military experience invaluable in predicting how a trained dog might navigate hostile terrain. "Here," Frank said, stabbing at a cluster of red circles on the map. "These cave systems, if Rex found those kids, he'd need shelter and water. This area has both." Margaret nodded, her respect for the old soldier growing. "How long do you think we have?" Frank's expression darkened. "In this heat?" "Not long, but Rex knows desert survival better than most humans. If anyone can keep them alive, it's him." The search helicopters had been circling since daybreak, their rotors churning the desert air into miniature sandstorms. From the cave entrance, Rex watched them pass overhead, his military mind torn between signaling for rescue and protecting his charges from potential threats. His training had taught him that not all helicopters brought safety. Some brought danger. The sound triggered vivid flashbacks to Afghanistan. Rex saw Maria's face in his mind, felt the concussion of the IED explosion that had stolen her life and shattered his world. His body began to shake, the post-traumatic stress overwhelming his careful control. The children sensed his distress immediately. Bethany climbed onto his back, her small arms wrapping around his neck in a fierce hug. "It's okay, Rex," she whispered into his ear. "We're safe." "You're safe." The child's words cut through his panic like a lifeline. Rex gradually regained control, marveling at how these tiny humans seemed to understand his psychological wounds better than any military psychiatrist. They needed him strong, and their need gave him strength. As the day progressed, Rex's condition began to deteriorate noticeably. The constant vigilance, the stress of responsibility, and his untreated injuries were taking their toll. He'd been rationing his own water intake to ensure the children had enough, a sacrifice that was slowly killing him. His breathing became labored, his movements more sluggish. Sophia noticed first. With the precocious intelligence of the eldest child, she recognized that their protector was suffering. "Rex is sick," she announced to her sisters, her voice carrying the authority of someone far older than her 3 years. The children held a whispered conference in their private language, the twin speak that had developed between them in the womb and persisted despite their triplet status. They emerged from their huddle with a plan that demonstrated both their innocence and their wisdom. They would take care of Rex the way he'd been taking care of them. Mary began singing softly, the lullabies their mother had hummed during bedtime routines that felt like a lifetime ago. Her sweet voice echoed off the cave walls, creating a soothing harmony that seemed to ease Rex's distress. Bethany continued her medical ministrations, using cool water from the spring to bathe his overheated body. Sophia organized their food sharing, ensuring Rex received larger portions despite his attempts to refuse. The role reversal was both heartbreaking and beautiful. These children, abandoned by the one person who should have protected them above all others, were now fiercely protecting their four-legged guardian with the same devotion he'd shown them. Meanwhile, the investigation into Richard Montgomery's disappearance was revealing disturbing truths. Detective Sarah Walsh had been assigned to the case, and her financial crimes unit was uncovering layers of debt and desperation that painted a complex picture. Bank records showed massive transfers to offshore accounts, loan documents with impossible terms, and a paper trail that led to some very dangerous people. "This wasn't random," she explained to Margaret during a brief radio check-in. "Montgomery was in deep with some serious players, the kind who make good on their threats." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. If Richard had been trying to protect his children by removing them from harm's way, his plan had horrifically backfired. The children were now in more danger than ever, and Rex was all that stood between them and the unforgiving desert. The second night brought new terrors. A pack of coyotes, drawn by the scent of vulnerable prey, began circling the cave entrance. Rex, despite his weakened condition, positioned himself as a barrier between the wild animals and the children. His lip curled back in a silent snarl, his hackles raised in a display of dominance that had sent insurgents fleeing in Afghanistan. The alpha coyote approached cautiously, testing the German shepherd's resolve. Rex's response was immediate and decisive, a deep, menacing growl that carried all the authority of his military training. The message was clear. These children were under his protection, and he would fight to the death to defend them. The standoff lasted hours. Rex never moved from his position, never showed weakness despite the pain coursing through his body. The children slept fitfully behind him, occasionally waking to find his reassuring presence still guarding their sanctuary. When dawn finally broke, the coyotes retreated, recognizing they faced not just a dog, but a warrior. Margaret's search teams were closing in. Her understanding of Rex's psychology, combined with Frank's military strategy and the latest satellite imagery, had narrowed the search area significantly. But time was running out. The Weather Service was predicting a severe sandstorm within the next 12 hours, the kind of weather event that could bury entire search operations and make rescue impossible. As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Rex made a decision that would define his legacy. The children were fading despite his best efforts. Their small bodies couldn't endure much more, and his own strength was nearly depleted. If rescuers were going to find them, they needed a signal. Despite every instinct that screamed against leaving his post, Rex knew he had to take the ultimate gamble. He had to leave the safety of the cave and make himself visible to the search helicopters, even if it meant exposing himself and the children to danger. The mission parameters had changed. Survival now required sacrifice, and Rex had never hesitated to make that choice when lives were at stake. As he prepared for what might be his final act of service, the children gathered around him with the intuitive understanding that something momentous was about to happen. Their small hands touched his scarred coat, offering comfort to the warrior who had given them everything. The final phase of Operation Guardian Angel was about to begin. The third dawn brought with it the ominous wall of dust that signaled the approaching sandstorm. Rex's military-trained eyes recognized the danger immediately, a massive weather system rolling across the Mojave like a brown tsunami, capable of reducing visibility to zero and turning the air into a choking hell of sand and debris. The storm would arrive within hours, and when it hit, any chance of rescue would vanish for days. Rex made his decision with the cold calculation of a battlefield commander. The children were too weak to survive another prolonged ordeal, and his own body was failing rapidly. If he didn't signal the search helicopters now, they would all die in this cave, their bones joining the countless others claimed by the desert's merciless embrace. He began with a series of sharp barks, the sound echoing off the canyon walls with startling clarity. It was a risk. The noise might attract predators or other dangers, but the approaching storm left no room for caution. His voice, hoarse from dehydration, carried the desperate urgency of a soldier calling for extraction under enemy fire. Sophia understood immediately. With the preternatural wisdom of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly, she recognized that Rex was sacrificing his concealment for their survival. "He's calling for help," she explained to her sisters, her small voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Margaret Chen heard the distant barking through her helicopter's headphones and felt her heart skip a beat. After 18 years of working with military dogs, she could distinguish Rex's voice from any other German shepherd. The sound was coming from the Eastern Canyon system, exactly where Frank Henderson had predicted they would find shelter. "That's him!" she shouted to the pilot over the rotor noise. "That's my dog!" The helicopter banked sharply toward the sound, racing against the approaching storm. Below them, the desert landscape was already beginning to change as the first wind gusts kicked up swirling dust devils. Margaret could see the massive wall of sand advancing like something out of an apocalyptic nightmare, swallowing the horizon and turning day into twilight. Rex continued his distress calls even as his strength ebbed away. Each bark sent shock waves of pain through his dehydrated body, but he persisted with the single-minded determination that had made him a legend among military working dogs. The children gathered around him, their small hands offering what comfort they could to their failing protector. Bethany pressed her face against his scarred muzzle, her blue eyes bright with tears. "Don't leave us, Rex," she whispered. "Please don't leave us like Daddy did." The words cut through Rex's consciousness like shrapnel. These children had already been abandoned once by someone who should have protected them. He would not, could not, let it happen again. Summoning reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed, Rex struggled to his feet and limped toward the cave entrance. The helicopter was closer now, its rotors creating their own dust storm as it circled the canyon. Margaret leaned out of the open door, scanning the rock formations below for any sign of life. Then she saw him, a familiar silhouette standing at the mouth of a cave, his body swaying with exhaustion, but his military bearing unmistakable even from a distance. "There!" she screamed, pointing toward the cave. "Rex! I see Rex!" The pilot maneuvered the aircraft as close as possible to the cliff face, fighting against increasing wind shear from the approaching storm. Through the swirling dust, Margaret could make out 3 small figures in bright dresses huddled behind the German shepherd. Her training as a rescue coordinator kicked in, assessing the situation with professional clarity, even as her heart broke at the sight of Rex's obvious distress. "We need to rappel down," she told the rescue specialist. "The children are too small for a basket hoist in this wind, and Rex won't leave them voluntarily." The first rescue rope dropped from the helicopter just as the leading edge of the sandstorm reached the canyon. Visibility plummeted to mere feet, and the wind began howling through the rock formations like a living thing. Margaret clipped into her harness and began her descent, knowing they had minutes at most before the storm made extraction impossible. Rex watched her approach with the wary recognition of a soldier identifying friend from foe. Margaret's scent reached him through the chaos, familiar, safe, belonging to his old life, but somehow appropriate for this moment. When she touched down in front of the cave, he didn't retreat, understanding instinctively that she was part of the rescue he had summoned. "Oh, Rex," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking as she saw the extent of his deterioration. His ribs showed prominently through his coat, his eyes were sunken with dehydration, and his injured leg could barely support his weight. But he stood firm, still protecting the children, even as his body failed him. The triplets regarded this new adult with the suspicious wariness of children who had learned that grown-ups could not always be trusted. But when Rex moved aside to allow Margaret into the cave, they accepted her presence with the simple logic of childhood. If their guardian approved, she must be safe. Working with desperate efficiency, Margaret began preparing the children for extraction. The storm was intensifying rapidly, turning the air into a sandblaster that made breathing difficult and visibility nearly impossible. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled through her radio, urgency clear despite the static. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before I have to pull back." "This storm's bigger than predicted." Margaret clipped the first harness around Sophia, who had insisted on going last to make sure her sisters were safe. "You're going to fly like a superhero," Margaret told her, trying to inject calm confidence into her voice despite the chaos surrounding them. But as they prepared for the ascent, Rex suddenly collapsed. The effort of signaling for rescue, combined with days of protecting the children at the expense of his own health, had finally overwhelmed his system. He lay on his side, his breathing shallow and labored, his amber eyes fixed on the children with desperate concern. "Rex!" Bethany screamed, breaking free from Margaret's grip to throw herself across the German shepherd's body. "Don't die! Please don't die!" Mary and Sophia joined their sister, creating a protective huddle around their fallen guardian. Their tears mixed with the dust and sand, creating muddy tracks down their cheeks as they pleaded with Rex to stay strong. Margaret faced an impossible choice. The helicopter couldn't wait much longer. The storm was becoming too dangerous for flight operations. She could save the children, but doing so might mean leaving Rex to die in the cave. Looking into his eyes, she saw that he understood the situation perfectly. He was a soldier, and soldiers knew the meaning of sacrifice. But as the wind howled around them, and the sand began to fill the air like a living thing, Margaret realized that some sacrifices were too great to ask. Rex had already given everything to protect these children. The question now was whether she could find a way to save them all, or whether the desert would claim its final victory. The storm was upon them, and time had run out. The helicopter lifted off into the screaming wind with Margaret, the 3 children, and Rex's unconscious form crammed into the rescue compartment. The German shepherd had collapsed completely during the extraction, his body finally succumbing to 3 days of relentless protection duty in the desert heat. As the aircraft fought against the sandstorm's fury, Margaret worked frantically to stabilize him, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had lost too many partners before. "His pulse is thready," she shouted to the medic over the rotor noise. "Severe dehydration, possible internal bleeding from old injuries, complete exhaustion." Rex's breathing was so shallow it was barely perceptible, his scarred body limp and unresponsive despite her efforts to rouse him. The children pressed against the windows, watching their desert sanctuary disappear into the brown maelstrom below. They had survived, but at what cost? Bethany refused to let go of Rex's paw, her small fingers wrapped around his motionless limb as if her touch alone could anchor his spirit to life. "Is Rex going to die?" Sophia asked, with the brutal directness that only children possess. Her blue eyes held none of the innocence they'd possessed 3 days ago. The desert had aged her beyond her years. Margaret's throat constricted. She wanted to offer false comfort, but these children had already been lied to enough. "I don't know, sweetheart. He's very sick." The emergency veterinary clinic in Las Vegas had been alerted, but even as they raced toward the city, Margaret could feel Rex slipping away. His military service had left him with a constellation of old injuries. shrapnel fragments that couldn't be removed, joint damage from countless missions, and the invisible wounds of post-traumatic stress that had driven him into the desert in the first place. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez was waiting when they arrived, her team already preparing for emergency surgery. As they transferred Rex to the examination table, the children clung to Margaret with desperate fear. They had lost their father to abandonment and nearly lost their lives to the desert. Now they were watching their savior disappear behind surgical doors, possibly forever. "We need to prepare you for the worst," Dr. Rodriguez said quietly to Margaret after the initial examination. "His kidney function is severely compromised. He's lost nearly 20% of his body weight, and there's evidence of internal bleeding. Even if we can stabilize him, the recovery would be extensive and expensive." The unspoken question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Rex was technically a stray, no official owner, no one legally responsible for his care. The surgery alone would cost thousands of dollars, with no guarantee of success. In the harsh mathematics of veterinary medicine, euthanasia was often the merciful choice. Meanwhile, the media circus surrounding the triplets' rescue had reached fever pitch. News vans surrounded the clinic, reporters clamoring for interviews about the miracle children and their hero dog. The story had everything networks craved: wealthy villains, innocent victims, and a dramatic animal rescue that tugged at heartstrings across America. Frank and Sarah Henderson arrived within hours, having driven through the tail end of the storm to reach the children. Sarah immediately took charge with the maternal authority of a woman who had raised 4 children and helped deliver dozens of grandchildren. She shepherded the triplets into a quiet corner of the waiting room, shielding them from the chaos while Frank dealt with the increasingly aggressive media presence. "Those babies don't need cameras shoved in their faces," Sarah declared, her voice carrying the steel that had kept her family together through 52 years of marriage. "They need stability and quiet, and people who actually care about them instead of their story." The preliminary surgery lasted 4 hours. Dr. Rodriguez emerged looking exhausted, her scrubs stained with blood, and her expression carefully neutral. The assembled group, Margaret, the Hendersons, several police officers, and a social worker, held their collective breath as she delivered her assessment. "We've stabilized the bleeding and started aggressive fluid therapy," she reported. "But his condition remains critical. The next 24 hours will tell us whether his organs can recover from the trauma." The children didn't understand the medical terminology, but they grasped the gravity in the adults' voices. Bethany began crying silently, the kind of heartbroken weeping that comes from losing too much too soon. Mary wrapped her arms around her youngest sister while Sophia stood rigid with the terrible responsibility of being strong for them all. As night fell over Las Vegas, Rex lay connected to machines that monitored every struggling heartbeat. His body was fighting the same battle it had waged in Afghanistan: survival against overwhelming odds, determination in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. But this time, he wasn't fighting alone. The children had been temporarily placed with the Hendersons, but they refused to leave the clinic. They took turns sitting beside Rex's kennel, talking to him in whispers, sharing memories of their desert adventure as if their voices could call him back from the brink. Outside, the investigation into Richard Montgomery's disappearance had taken a disturbing turn. Detective Walsh had uncovered evidence of death threats, financial extortion, and a desperate father's impossible choice between certain death and possible survival. But inside the veterinary clinic, none of that mattered. All that mattered was whether a war-scarred German shepherd would live to see another sunrise, and whether 3 small children would lose the only hero they had left. The truth about Richard Montgomery began unraveling on the 4th day, while Rex fought for his life in the veterinary ICU. Detective Sarah Walsh had been methodically piecing together the financial puzzle, and what she discovered painted a picture far more complex than simple abandonment. The breakthrough came when she traced a series of encrypted phone calls made to Richard's cell phone in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. "These aren't bill collectors," Walsh explained to the assembled team in the police briefing room. "These are professionals, the kind who specialize in collecting debts through intimidation and violence." She pulled up photographs on the projection screen, surveillance images of known associates of the Torino crime family, men whose business cards listed them as consultants, but whose true profession was enforcing payment through fear. The phone records revealed an escalating pattern of threats. Early calls were brief and businesslike. Later ones stretched for 30 or 40 minutes, long enough for detailed descriptions of what would happen to Richard's family if his debts remained unpaid. The final call, made just 6 hours before the children were found in the desert, lasted 57 minutes. "He wasn't abandoning them," Walsh continued, her voice heavy with the weight of revelation. "He was trying to save them." Margaret Chen felt her stomach lurch as the implications sank in. While she'd been searching for Rex in the desert, Richard Montgomery had been making the most agonizing calculation a parent could face: temporary abandonment versus permanent loss. The loan sharks had made it clear that the children would pay for their father's debts in ways too horrible to contemplate. Frank Henderson studied the surveillance photos with the keen eye of a man who'd seen real evil during his military service. "So he figured the desert was safer than staying home? It was supposed to be temporary," Walsh explained, pulling up Richard's credit card records. "He used his last available funds to book 3 separate flights: Los Angeles, Chicago, and Miami, all departing within hours of each other. Classic misdirection. Then he drove to a payphone 50 miles from where he left the girls and called in the anonymous tip." The plan had been desperate but logical in its own twisted way. Richard would disappear, making the loan sharks believe he'd fled with whatever money he could scrape together. The children would be found quickly and placed in protective custody. By the time the criminals realized they'd been duped, Richard would be dead or in hiding, and the children would be safe in the system. "But he didn't count on the sandstorm," Sarah Henderson said quietly. She'd been caring for the triplets while they maintained their vigil at Rex's bedside, and the weight of their trauma was evident in her voice. Or on how long it would take to find them. The revelation sent shockwaves through the media circus surrounding the case. Overnight, Richard Montgomery transformed from villain to tragic hero in the public consciousness. Talk show hosts debated the ethics of his choice, while online forums exploded with passionate arguments about parental duty versus impossible circumstances. At the veterinary clinic, the children remained unaware of these developments. Their world had contracted to the size of Rex's recovery kennel, where machines beeped steadily and their unconscious protector lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. They had established their own rotation, Sophia taking the morning shift, Mary the afternoon, and Bethany refusing to leave his side after dinner. "Doctor?" Rodriguez had been cautiously optimistic about Rex's kidney function returning to normal, but a new complication emerged on the 5th day. The German Shepherd's old shrapnel wounds had become infected, his body's immune system too depleted to fight off the bacteria that had been dormant in his system for years. The infection was spreading rapidly, requiring aggressive antibiotic treatment that his already compromised organs might not survive. "It's like his body is fighting a war on multiple fronts," Dr. Rodriguez explained to Margaret during one of their daily consultations. "The dehydration, the exhaustion, the old injuries, everything is connected. Treating one problem creates stress on another system." Margaret nodded, understanding the military metaphor better than most. Rex was like a soldier who'd been wounded in battle and was now facing a secondary infection that could prove more deadly than the original injury. She'd seen it happen to human soldiers too, survivors of combat who made it through the initial trauma only to succumb to complications weeks or months later. The medical bills were mounting rapidly, and the question of payment loomed over every treatment decision. Rex had no owner on record, no insurance, and no legal advocate beyond Margaret's unofficial guardianship. The clinic had been generous in providing emergency care, but they couldn't absorb unlimited costs for a stray animal, regardless of his heroic status. That's when the community began to mobilize in ways that surprised everyone involved. The first donation came from Frank Henderson, his entire disability check from the Veterans Administration. "That dog served his country just like I did," he told the clinic staff, "and he saved those babies when their own father couldn't." Sarah Henderson organized a fund through their church, which quickly spread to other congregations across Las Vegas. Local businesses began posting collection jars with Rex's photo, usually accompanied by images of the triplets in their bright sundresses. The story had captured imaginations in a way that transcended typical animal rescue appeals. More significantly, Margaret received an unexpected call from her former commanding officer, Colonel James Mackenzie, now retired and living in Colorado. He'd been following the story and wanted to discuss Rex's military service record. "That dog saved 12 American soldiers during his tours," Mackenzie said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen Rex in action. "He's got more decorations than most humans I know. If the military won't take care of its own, we've lost our way entirely." The call led to a remarkable discovery. Rex had been eligible for veterans' benefits all along: medical care, disability compensation for his service-related injuries, and burial honors when his time came. The paperwork had been lost in bureaucratic shuffles following his handler's death, but Mackenzie's intervention reopened the files and established Rex's official veteran status. "He's not just a stray dog," Mackenzie explained to Dr. Rodriguez during a conference call. "He's a decorated war veteran who earned his benefits through blood and service. Every medical treatment he needs is covered." The news reached the children during one of their evening visits to Rex's kennel. Bethany was reading him a picture book about brave dogs while her sisters colored get-well cards when Margaret arrived with the update about his veteran status. "Does that mean Rex is going to be okay?" Sophia asked, her voice carrying the weight of too much loss for someone so young. Margaret knelt beside the kennel where Rex lay, connected to monitors and IV lines. His breathing had stabilized, and Dr. Rodriguez reported that his kidney function was slowly improving. The infection was responding to antibiotics, and for the first time in days, his vital signs showed genuine improvement rather than mere stabilization. "It means Rex is getting the best care possible," Margaret said carefully. "And it means people understand that he's a hero who deserves to be treated like one." As if responding to her words, Rex's eyes fluttered open for the first time since the surgery. His gaze was unfocused and weak, but when Bethany placed her small hand against the kennel door, his tail moved in the faintest suggestion of a wag. The road to recovery would be long and uncertain, but Rex was fighting back with the same determination that had carried him through 3 tours of duty. And this time, he wasn't fighting alone. 6 months after the desert rescue, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the Henderson ranch house, illuminating a scene that would have been unimaginable during those dark days in the veterinary clinic. Rex lay on a custom orthopedic bed in the living room, his scarred coat gleaming with health, watching as 3 blonde girls in matching school uniforms prepared for their day. The German Shepherd's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. Dr. Rodriguez still used his case as an example when speaking to veterinary students about the healing power of purpose and love. The infection that had nearly killed him was gone, his kidney function had returned to normal, and while his old war wounds would always cause some discomfort, he moved with the dignity of a soldier who had completed his final mission with honor. Sophia, now 4 years old and the undisputed leader of the trio, was organizing their backpacks with the methodical precision she'd inherited from her mother. Mary helped Bethany tie her shoes, their morning routine a symphony of cooperation that Rex observed with protective satisfaction. These were no longer the terrified children he'd found in the desert. They had blossomed into confident, caring individuals under the Hendersons' loving care. The adoption had been finalized 3 months ago after a legal battle that had captivated the nation. Sarah and Frank Henderson, at ages 71 and 74 respectively, had fought for the right to become the triplets' legal guardians against social services departments that questioned their age and ability to raise young children. Margaret Chen had served as their character witness, describing how the elderly couple had provided the stability and unconditional love the children desperately needed. "Family isn't about age," Sarah had told the family court judge during the hearing. "It's about showing up every day, loving unconditionally, and never giving up on each other. These girls have already lost too much. They need people who understand that commitment isn't temporary." The judge, moved by the obvious bond between the children and their would-be grandparents, had agreed. The adoption ceremony had been held in the same courtroom, with Rex lying quietly beside the judge's bench, wearing a red bow tie that Bethany had insisted upon. When the gavel fell, making the adoption official, the girls had rushed to hug their new grandparents, while Rex's tail wagged with what could only be described as approval. Richard Montgomery watched the ceremony from federal prison in California, where he was serving a reduced sentence thanks to his cooperation with authorities investigating the Torino crime family. His testimony had helped convict 12 members of the organization, effectively dismantling their Nevada operations. In exchange, his sentence had been reduced to 5 years, with the possibility of parole in 3. The children visited him once a month, accompanied by Sarah Henderson and a court-appointed supervisor. These meetings were awkward at first, with Richard struggling to explain his actions in terms his daughters could understand. But gradually they began to heal the relationship damaged by his desperate choices in the desert. "Daddy made a mistake," Sophia had explained to her sisters after one particularly difficult visit. "But he thought he was protecting us. Sometimes grown-ups make bad choices when they're scared." Rex had become something of a celebrity in his own right. The story of the war veteran dog who saved 3 abandoned children had resonated far beyond Nevada, inspiring books, documentaries, and even a Hollywood movie deal that Margaret had negotiated to benefit military working dog charities. But more importantly, Rex had found his true calling as a therapy dog. Working with Margaret, who had established a nonprofit organization called Guardian Angel Service Dogs, Rex spent his days visiting children's hospitals, veterans' facilities, and trauma centers. His gentle presence and obvious scars made him especially effective with young patients dealing with their own injuries and fears. Children who had been withdrawn and silent would often speak their first words to Rex, finding comfort in his patient understanding. The program had expanded to include other retired military working dogs, creating a network of healing that stretched across the Southwest. Frank Henderson, drawing on his Vietnam experience, served as the program's volunteer coordinator, while Sarah managed the fundraising efforts with the efficiency of a general planning a campaign. "Rex taught us something important," Margaret often told the families they served. "Healing isn't about forgetting the past or pretending trauma didn't happen. It's about finding new purpose, new family, and new ways to serve others." On this particular morning, as the girls finished their breakfast and prepared for school, Rex demonstrated the routine that had become his favorite part of each day. He walked slowly to the front door, his slight limp barely noticeable now, and picked up his red therapy vest from its hook. The girls giggled as he brought it to Sarah, his tail wagging with anticipation. "Looks like someone's ready for work," Sarah said, scratching behind his ears. "We're visiting the children's cancer ward today, aren't we, boy?" Rex's schedule was carefully managed to prevent overexertion, but his enthusiasm for his therapy work was undimmed. Dr. Rodriguez had cleared him for light duty, emphasizing that the mental stimulation and sense of purpose were as important to his health as any medication. The doorbell rang, and Margaret Chen entered with her customary smile and armload of supplies for the day's therapy sessions. She had become like an aunt to the triplets, her official role as Rex's handler blending seamlessly into her unofficial position as extended family member. "Ready for another adventure?" she asked Rex, who responded by gently taking his therapy vest in his teeth and bringing it to her. The sight never failed to amaze her. This dog who had survived war, abandonment, and near death was still eager to serve, still committed to protecting and healing others. As they prepared to leave for their therapy rounds, Bethany approached Rex with a new drawing she'd made in art class. It showed a large dog surrounded by small figures, all holding hands under a bright yellow sun. At the bottom, in her careful kindergarten handwriting, she had written, "Rex is our hero forever." Rex accepted the paper gently in his mouth, careful not to damage it, then delivered it to Margaret as he'd been trained to do with important documents during his military service. But this wasn't intelligence or reconnaissance. This was love, pure and simple, from a child to the guardian who had saved her life and taught her the meaning of unconditional loyalty. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows as the newest chapter of their shared story began, filled with purpose, healing, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of the Mojave Desert. Sometimes life forces us to make impossible choices, like Richard Montgomery facing threats to his children, or Rex choosing between his own survival and protecting 3 helpless babies in the desert. But this story proves that our darkest moments can become the foundation for our greatest blessings. Sarah and Frank Henderson, at 71 and 74, thought their parenting days were over, until 3 little girls and a war-scarred dog showed them that family isn't about age, it's about showing up with love every single day. Rex found his true purpose not as a military hero, but as a healer, bringing comfort to children in hospitals. The triplets discovered that sometimes the best fathers have 4 legs and the most devoted grandparents have silver hair and hearts full of wisdom. Margaret learned that the family she'd been searching for was waiting in an adoption courtroom, not a dating app. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about second chances, chosen family, and the beautiful truth that our lives can begin again at any age. Every ending is really a new beginning in disguise, and the best chapters of our lives might still be unwritten. What impossible choice in your own life led to unexpected blessings? Have you ever found that what felt like an ending was actually a beautiful beginning? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how life surprised you with second chances.